Austin, Texas has experienced a remarkable surge in population growth, fueled by a booming economy and unparalleled quality of life. However, this rapid urban expansion has exposed the city to a pressing challenge, an acute housing and development crisis, exacerbated by restrictive zoning laws. Despite efforts to modernize the zoning code to address density within the metropolitan area and accommodate more affordable housing, these efforts have been unsuccessful due to political objection, stagnation, and bureaucracy. Follow me as we look into how we can reshape Austin and solve the zoning dilemma once and for all. Zoning regulations that limit density or restrict the types of housing have been a part of Austin's zoning history for many decades. Here's a brief history of some of the key zoning regulations that have impacted the development of housing in the city.
Brief history of our code. It was designed in 1984 when the city of Austin looked much, much different than it does now.
Yeah.
And the prevailing political sentiment at the time was slow growth. Like, if we don't build it, they won't come.
Yeah.
Right. And that is still somewhat pervasive, and it's why we still have the code that we have, and we haven't been able to change it. But that has been pervasive in the face of it's undeniable at this point that we're in a serious housing crisis. And so that's why we're just seeing some momentum appear now.
Austin began the process of revisiting its zoning laws and undertaking the Code Next initiative in 2012. Why did it face so many delays, political disagreements, and ultimately fail to be adopted?
So in 2012, I think it was 2012, City Council passed, for lack of the appropriate word, like an initiative to direct staff to rewrite the zoning code, and then to give it back to City Council to debate it and pass it. And so it took them all the way from 2012 to 2019 to get something that they could all agree on and pass. So it passed. Then it immediately was taken to court, and the basis of that lawsuit is a state law.
Through state law, that is what they call the valid petition process. And if you are within let's say, I take the lot where your office is and I want to build like a high-rise apartment on it. I have to give notice to people within a certain distance that there's going to be this change in zoning. The people can come in. There's a process by which they can appeal and create what they call a valid petition. I think if it's over 70% of adjacent landowners.
Yeah. Basically a 200-foot deep donut around your site. Right. And if you take up the square footage of that donut and you add up all of the neighbors, if 20% of the square footage of that donut is represented or owned by people who sign a petition against your rezone, it becomes what's called a valid petition.
Then they can all sign off, and then that would change the metric within the city charter, and a supermajority
to veto that petition. So in this case, 9 out of 11.
And we've never been even close to that, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're at basically 7 pro-housing, 4 not so pro-housing.
The problem is that, like, when you go into passing Code Next, we again governed by this mass consensus where no one can agree, and we're constantly making concessions, and no one can actually make an executive decision to say what is correct. And so we went into this giant circular motion to where it just continually got watered down, watered down, watered down.
Yeah.
So now we have hypothetical mapping with larger zoning on corridors. Nothing's been done.
Nothing's been done.
And we're back to square one. Again, the problem is that we have this electorate that is responsive only to a small minority of Austin, and so Allison Alter's constituents are going to be very different than someone in a different district, right?
Yeah.
So that's going to be and everyone's responsive to those things. For example, Allison's district, which is up northwest Austin, is their primary concern, and a lot of arguments you'll see is this transition of trying to make it easier to develop larger lots or put more units on a lot. There's a lot of resistance from her constituents against that. Yeah. Whereas other areas, that's really would be helpful in order to bring affordable housing into the central core.
We have something in Austin called compatibility setbacks, right? And this is the single biggest obstacle to developing more dense housing in the city of Austin. Compatibility setbacks is the concept that you may be allowed to build up to 60 feet, but if you're right next door to a residential structure, then there's an additional limit on your height. And it's basically it's a diagonal graph.
Yeah.
That we got into the debate over, well, here's the problem. Great, you want to let us go up to 90 feet, but too many properties right now can't even get 60 feet. So what does this really do? Austin is in the middle of one of the worst housing crises in the entire country, but we also have the most stringent compatibility setbacks in the entire country.
Yeah.
Well, you talk about a decade worth of back and forth on Code Next. Each incremental change watered down the intent. When you talk about development now, oftentimes what has to be done is we can only build condos. Like you can, because the idea is that our land development code is not incentivized in any capacity to try and like break land up into individual ownership, which is what most, as a realtor yourself, like most people prefer. You don't necessarily mind being in an HOA, but the idea is you prefer to like own your land, right?
Yeah.
It's the Texas way. And I think that there's a huge market for that, but our land development code does not allow that. So that circles back as to like what the city's goals were inside Code Next. And part of it was to make unique development standards that could be spread throughout the city. Because currently most single family lots are zoned what they call SF3, which is the minimum 5750. So they had talked about changing minimum lot size, allowing the number of units that could be built on an individual lot, and changing that. Currently it's maxed out at 2.
Yeah.
Changing something as simple as changing it to 4.
What this really is about is getting 2 other people on board with something that will ease our housing crisis in a way that they can stomach.
So it is progressing slowly, but it's progressing.
Right.
Since we started making this video in 2023, there's been a ton of developments that have occurred within the city about the proposed changes to the zoning, and we've even seen some resolutions changed. So check out the video where we interviewed Chris Affinito and Austin Stowell in January, and we went over what's going to happen with our city and what is likely to happen with the zoning changes.